Hi, I am Sherlock. Welcome to my new mystery case.
The November fog lay upon Baker Street like damp wool, muffling the rattle of cabs and softening the edge of every lamp into a halo. Inside our rooms, the fire held firm against the chill, and Holmes, cross-legged upon the settee, had set a violin across his knees as if it were a question he was loath to answer. I had just returned from an early call on a patient in Marylebone, an old soldier with lungs as stubborn as his stories, and was shaking the rain from my hat when Holmes regarded me with that dry twinkle which was his nearest approach to amiability. "You have mislaid one of your gloves, Watson," said he, "and you were offered sherry but declined it, more from professional discipline than taste, I think." "You are in rare form this morning," I laughed, though his accuracy pricked me as it always did. I confess I fell back upon coffee, and the glove, well, I must have left it on the mantel of Captain Pierce's rooms. "Not the mantel," Holmes returned, drawing his bow across the A string so gently that the note hovered like breath upon a window pane. "A writing desk, oak, cracked at the right corner, on which you placed it while examining a bottle of cough mixture. The sleeve of your overcoat caught the edge of a blotter and left a scarcely visible smear upon your cuff. Coffee would not do that." Before I could fashion a retort, the bell jangled below. Mrs. Hudson's steps mounted, and a moment later a visitor was shown in. He was a tall, narrow man in clerical dress, the black silk of his cravat wet to a dull sheen. The face above it was pinched and respectable, and his hands, long, with clean, square nails, twitched against one another like anxious birds. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes," he ventured. Holmes's eyelids drooped in that cat-like way of his, which took in a figure entire. "You come, sir, from the city by way of Fleet Street, where you stopped long enough to change your mind. Pray warm yourself, Reverend Pritchard." Our visitor started. "I am Elias Pritchard, curate of St. Margaret's in Bride Lane. But how?" "The printer's ink upon your thumb, the news sheet folded into quarters in your pocket, and the damp on your right shoulder only, caught, I think, while you hesitated under the projecting sign of Greeley's Tea Room. You were uncertain whether to seek the police or me, and compromised upon prayer. It often has that effect." A ghost of a smile troubled the curate's strained features. He sank into the chair nearest the fire, and for a moment allowed the heat to take the stiffness from his hands. When he spoke, his voice ran in that gentle, urgent cadence of the pulpit. "It is a death, Mr. Holmes, a death within the chapel itself, and under circumstances that, well, I'm ashamed to say it, have already excited talk." Holmes set down the violin. "Talk is the cheapest coin of London," he observed. "Pay me instead with facts. Who is dead?" "Mrs. Honoria Vale," said Pritchard, swallowing. "The widow of Mr. Jonas Vale, the ship-owner. A great benefactress to our parish. She was found at dawn kneeling at the prie-dieu in St. Bride's Chapel, as if in prayer. Quite cold." "By whom was she found?" "Our verger, Tom Grieve. He opens the church at 6. The chapel door was bolted within. He fetched me, and I sent for the beadle, and, after some hammering and debate, a locksmith. We gained entry at 6:45. "Bolted within," Holmes repeated, his gaze sliding to the dancing coal. "And the windows?" "Small lancets of stained glass high in the wall. They do not open." "And the bolt, Mr. Pritchard? Could a hand from without manipulate it by any contrivance?" "No, sir. It is an old thing of iron that falls into a socket with a weighty sound. I have heard it 100 times." Holmes steepled his fingers. "Pray continue." "There is little more that I can say with certainty," the curate confessed. "Mrs. Vale had a habit, since her husband's passing, of coming to the chapel alone. My silent hour, she called it. She would kneel in the half-light before the little statue of St. Margaret, Though we are Anglican, the carving is ancient and not without charm, and she would pray. We discourage such solitary vigils, but she was a lady of means and temper. Last evening was the anniversary of Mr. Vale's death. She asked that the chapel be left unlit and undisturbed from 9 o'clock onward, and that the south door of the church be left on the latch. I am ashamed to say we complied. When we forced the inner door this morning, she was, as I have told you, on the cushion there, kneeling. Watson, I felt that familiar chill which no accumulation of medical facts can entirely banish. Holmes's face, however, grew only more abstracted. Had she the means to secure the chapel from within? He asked. There is a bolt on the chapel door, yes. But I cannot say. Mr. Greaves swears he heard it fall some time after 10. He sleeps in a little room beneath the tower, and is used to the sounds of the church. Any sign of violence? Pritchard's hands fluttered. None obvious. The physician who was called, Mr. Larkin from Mitre Court, he suggested apoplexy or failure of the heart. Mrs. Vale had suffered of late from what she termed her black vapours. Yet there were oddities. I am not a fanciful man, Mr. Holmes, but they pressed upon me. Name them. The candles, said Pritchard, lowering his voice despite himself. We keep a rack of tapers by the chapel. 2 were missing from their sockets, but no stumps remained. And there was a smell in the air, a sweetish odour, not incense, we do not use it. Something like orange peel gone stale. Bitter almonds? I asked. The physician in me pricked to attention. Pritchard looked helpless. I cannot be sure. Holmes's eyes flicked to me and away. What else? A handkerchief, the curate said. Lace, very fine, lying folded upon the rail. Not Mrs. Vale's. She was plain in her habits. And, this may be of no consequence, one of the bell ropes in the tower had been tugged hard in the small hours. Mr. Greaves says there was a single stroke at, it must have been near 2. He thought at first he had dreamed it. Holmes rose without haste, which in him was the surest sign of inward acceleration. You did well to come. Inspector Lestrade of the Yard will not thank you for it, but I have long since ceased to arrange my life for that gentleman's gratitude. He turned to me. Your hat, Watson. The air of the Fleet is never improved by delay. We were in a hansom within 10 minutes, the horses' iron shoes beating a dull tattoo through the fog. Pritchard, between us, stared straight ahead, as if the passing of each murky lamp were a bead on some private rosary. Holmes, for his part, had lapsed into the vacancy that is the prelude to his exactest attention. I have seen him so upon the threshold of cases which would have daunted a magistrate's bench and baffled a committee of physicians. It was as if he withdrew the feelers of his mind in order to thrust them forth the further. St. Margaret's in Bride Lane crouched like a penitent between taller, meaner buildings, its tower shouldering the fog. Within, the air was cold and smelled faintly of wet stone and old books. Pritchard led us past the nave into a smaller chapel, whose narrow windows admitted a meagre greenish light. The locksmith's violence had splintered the door in the night. The broken wood still gaped like a wound. There, he whispered. A simple prie-dieu stood before a niche where a medieval carving regarded us with patient severity. On the cushion, the marks of knees were deeply pressed. I approached with that mixture of pity and professional habit which visits the medical man in the presence of sudden death. The impression of a head had disturbed the nap of the velvet at the rail. A strand of grey hair clung to the wood. Upon the rail itself, neatly folded, lay a square of lace, so delicate one hesitated to breathe upon it. Holmes bent, not touching, and sniffed the air. You perceive it, Watson? I do, I said. A faint odour, not bitter almonds, closer to orange flower water. Or to certain cosmetics. Holmes murmured. His gaze had moved to the floor. "And what have we here?" He indicated 3 tiny grains near the foot of the prie-dieu, white against the dark stone. He produced his lens and lowered himself until his face was inches from the slab, his whole body becoming, as it were, an instrument of sight. "Salt," he observed at last. "Sea salt, to be precise, with a minute admixture of soot." He glanced up at Pritchard. "Mrs. Vale's late husband was a ship owner, you said?" "Yes. His ships trade as far as the Baltic." Holmes straightened, and the lazy drawl returned, which always masked the click of thought. "And the bolt?" Pritchard showed him the heavy iron which fell into the socket with a sullen clank. Holmes examined the recess, ran a finger along its depths, and then, with a quick movement, held that finger to the light. A smear, scarcely more than a suggestion, shone upon it. "Grease," he said, "fresh, applied with care. There is method here that does not belong to sudden seizure, Mr. Pritchard." He crossed to the little rack where the tapers stood. Several stumps were neatly aligned. 2 stations were empty. Holmes studied the soot upon the nearest sconce, then the stone before it, where a faint oval, cleaner than the surrounding dust, suggested the resting of some small object recently removed. "What do you make of it, Holmes?" I asked, for his silence grew heavy. "Only that Mrs. Honoria Vale came last night to pray in silence," he said. "And someone else came to pray for her more effectually than any curate. The manner in which that prayer was answered is locked more firmly than this door ever was. But locks and prayers, Watson, have this in common. Both are contrived by men, and therefore both may be opened." He turned then to the lace handkerchief, to the tiny grains on the stone, and finally to a faint mark upon the velvet where the rail had pressed. An impression, narrow and sharp at the end, like that of a pin. "Tell me, Reverend," he said without looking up, "did Mrs. Vale wear a veil?" Pritchard's eyes flickered at the question. "On Sundays, yes, a modest net veil. During the week, she went plain." Holmes inclined his head, as if a bead had fallen into place upon a larger string. He moved with unhurried economy about the chapel, pausing at the velvet rail where the pin-like indentation marred the nap, then at the bolt socket, and finally before the niche where the old saint gazed down. "If Mr. Larkin has not certified," he said, "Watson will give the body a professional glance. I do not press a theory, Mr. Pritchard. I avoid one." We followed the curate to a vestry smelling of linen and wax. Mrs. Honoria Vale lay upon a trestle, decently covered. At Holmes's nod I turned back the sheet. The features were composed, the lips faintly discoloured, the hands folded with deliberate neatness. "Any marks?" Holmes murmured. "None to the throat," I said, then hesitated. "There is a minute abrasion under the angle of the jaw, with a rim of irritation. The pupils are not markedly contracted. The extremities show little lividity." Holmes bent near the mouth without touching. "The odour persists. Orange flower water, or a cosmetic which feigns it. And the hands?" "Clean, without staining." He looked up. "We shall not anticipate chemistry with metaphysics. Cover her, Watson." When I had done so, he turned to Pritchard. "You have told me of candles missing, a handkerchief mislaid, a bell tugged. Keep every trifle in its place, above all the rail and the prie-dieu. I may wish to see them at dusk." A step in the passage concluded in the doorway. Inspector Lestrade entered, short and square. "Ah, Mr. Holmes is beforehand with us? You might leave a case to the police." "When the police leave a case to itself, it commonly goes wrong," Holmes returned amiably. "You have a death in a locked chapel. I applaud the locksmith. I doubt the apoplexy." Lestrade sniffed. The curate admits the door was bolted. The verger heard it fall. The windows are tight. You have a ghost, if you like ghosts. I prefer sailors, said Holmes. Sea salt on a chapel floor is rare. The widow managed a mariner's widow's fund with Mr. Richard Hargreave and a Captain Doran. That will serve to begin. Come, Watson. Outside, the fog had thinned to a grey broth. We found Vale and Company near the river, brass plate, oiled doors, a smell of tar. Mr. Hargreave received us in a room square as his jaw. "The lady's death is a misfortune," he said. "If you desire the charity's accounts, they are open. If you desire my time, it is limited." "Your time last night between 9 and midnight?" Holmes asked. "At home in Kensington with my wife." "You parted from Mrs. Vale on amicable terms?" "On firm ones. We did not always agree. She had a taste for severity. The fund is sound. There has been talk of favour or prejudice. I keep figures. She kept principles." Holmes's gaze wandered as if idly. A photograph showed Hargreave, Mrs. Vale, and a bearded, barrel-chested man before a ship. "Captain Doran," Hargreave supplied. "Retired 3 years. Brave, but he romances the sea. He would carry old errors as if they were medals." "His address?" Hargreave provided it with cool precision. Holmes's eye paused for an instant upon a blotter, where a faint ring suggested a damp glass. Then we took our leave. Captain Doran's lodgings stood in a narrow street that smelled of rope and malt. The captain himself answered, a great fellow with a beard like stiff surf and eyes which had not learned to sit tamely in a parlour. He showed us into a room crowded with models and trophies. "You will have heard," Holmes began, "of Mrs. Vale's death." "A hard woman ends hard," the captain said, then catching himself added, "She kept some afloat." "You quarrelled with her?" Holmes observed. "We differed," Doran returned. "She wished a clean book more than a clean conscience sometimes. A man can be broke and still worth the rope that holds him." "At what hour were you in port last night?" "In port? I was at the Dolphin till 11. Ask the landlord." Holmes's glance went to a small shelf where a bottle sat, its stopper crusted and its label stained. He said nothing of it. Instead, he rose and took the captain's hand in farewell. The big palm had a faint smell I could not place, sweet and stale at once. Back in the street, Holmes listened to the muffled debate of the river and the traffic. "We have a veil that may have been pinned, a scratch that may have been dipped, salt that should be ashore only in sermons, and a bell rope that answered a prayer at 2 in the morning. Lestrade has a locked door. I have a door that was locked after the need for doors had ceased. Before dusk we shall pay a chemist and a chandler. After dusk we shall pay the chapel." "For what purpose?" "For light and for shadow, Watson. There are devotions that require both this evening." The fog still hung low over the embankment when we quitted Captain Doran's street. Holmes hailed a cab, and once inside he lapsed into his familiar stillness, his chin drawn into his scarf, eyes half closed yet sharper than ever. I have learned that such silences in him are the surest evidence of his brain's fiercest activity. For a mile we rattled along in this fashion, until at last he spoke, his tone brisk and measured. "There is work to be done, Watson, of 2 kinds, one to do with candles, another to do with poisons. The former may be satisfied at a chandler's shop, the latter by our old ally Mr. Stamford, who still keeps his little laboratory by Bart's. We shall divide the day accordingly." True to his word, we first alighted at a narrow shop off Ludgate Hill, where the air reeked of tallow and wax. Holmes questioned the proprietor with casual politeness that belied the keenness of his inquiries. 2 gentlemen, he learned, had purchased fine wax tapers, late the night before, one stout and loud with a sailor's rolling gait, the other more refined, who paid in coin but said little. They had asked for tapers of the very type missing from St. Margaret's rack. Holmes took note of the times mentioned, thanked the man with his habitual brevity, and we returned to the cab. 2 tapers, 2 men, Holmes murmured as we drove. One provides the shadow, the other the flame. The symmetry offends me, Watson. Life is never symmetrical unless some human hand strives to make it so. At Bart's hospital, Holmes introduced himself with his usual disregard for ceremony, and Stamford welcomed us with cautious warmth. Holmes produced from his pocket a scrap of velvet nap from the prie-dieu, into which he had pressed a pinch of the white grains we had discovered. He requested a chemical analysis. Stamford set to work with his reagents while Holmes prowled the benches like a restless hawk. Within minutes, the verdict came. "Sea salt, yes," said Stamford, "but it is mixed with trace arsenite, small enough that only a few grains would not suffice to kill. It suggests contamination rather than deliberate dosage." Holmes's lips curved in that half-smile I knew too well. Contamination, indeed, but of what? A handkerchief steeped in cosmetic, a pin coated with powder, or a more deliberate vessel? He thanked Stamford with one of his rare handshakes, and we were once more upon the street. By afternoon we returned to Baker Street for a hasty meal. Holmes paced as I ate, striking his long fingers against one another. We have a scratch upon the jaw, a missing veil perhaps affixed with a poisoned pin, 2 tapers employed for some dark ritual, and a bell that tolled when no hand should have reached it. Each fact by itself is curious. Together they begin to compose a theme. This evening, Watson, we shall observe the chapel under the same conditions that attended Mrs. Vale's death. I have asked Pritchard to leave the south door upon the latch once more. We reached St. Margaret's shortly after 9, the hour Mrs. Vale had chosen for her solitary devotions. The streets were hushed, the fog thinner, and the lamps glimmered like sullen eyes. Pritchard met us with a nervous bow and departed, his conscience evidently strained by our experiment. Holmes and I slipped into the nave, where the shadows pressed close against the arches. Holmes seated himself in the very spot where the widow had knelt, his figure scarcely discernible in the gloom. "Observe, Watson," he whispered. "The candles are gone, but the sconces remain. The absent tapers would have cast narrow pools of light, leaving much in shadow. Consider also the angle of the prie-dieu and the bolt. A hand outside might have contrived to push it home with a thin rod, provided the keyhole was suitably greased. Hence the fresh smear I observed this morning. Our ghost of a locked room vanishes." As he spoke, a faint sound stirred above us, a whisper of rope shifting against beam. Holmes's head snapped up. From the tower came the single dull thud of a bell, smothered as though by a careful hand. We froze. Footsteps moved stealthily in the gallery. Holmes rose, signalling me to silence. In the dim light, a figure descended by the side stair. Cloaked and hooded, it glided to the prie-dieu. The intruder knelt, and I saw the hand extend something toward the velvet rail, a folded handkerchief, white against the gloom. Holmes moved like lightning, seizing the figure by the wrist. A cry escaped the stranger, high and startled, unmistakably feminine. "Release me," she gasped. "Not until you explain why you repeat the widow's vigil," Holmes said sternly. He drew back the hood, and the face of a young woman was revealed, pale and striking, with eyes that flashed even in the scant light. "I am Clara Vale," she said, "the widow's niece." Holmes's grasp did not slacken. "And why, Miss Vale, do you imitate your aunt's prayers in secret with handkerchiefs and candles and bells rung at unholy hours?" She drew herself up with proud defiance. "Because someone has slandered her memory, Mr. Holmes. They say she died in shame, whispering of poisons and strange rites." I sought to prove how easily her devotion could be made to seem sinister. "I came here last night too. I lit the candles, I placed the lace, I even tugged the bell rope to frighten the gossip mongers, I swear it." Holmes regarded her with a gaze that pierced like steel. "You are frank, Miss Vale, yet your confession explains too much and too little. You may have supplied the shadows, but who supplied the silence? Your aunt's death remains unsolved, and your presence here proves there is more beneath the veil than filial zeal. Watson, I believe we have reached the second act of our drama." The girl trembled, but did not flinch. "Then you must find the truth, Mr. Holmes, for I swear upon my life I meant no harm." Holmes released her wrist at last. "So you shall have your wish, but beware, those who play at shadows may find the light less merciful than they expect." And with that, the bell above us shivered once more, as though unseen hands mocked our vigil. Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Come, Watson, the trap is tightening, though the prey may not yet know it." Holmes stood very still in the dim chapel, his fingers steepled and his head inclined toward the bell tower. Clara Vale's breath came quickly, but she bore his scrutiny with admirable steadiness. I confess my own nerves were less firm, for there was something uncanny in the echo of that second toll, as if the tower itself sought to remind us of death. Holmes at last spoke, his voice low and precise. "Miss Vale, your admission absolves you of one deception and implicates you in another. To contrive a semblance of haunting is a grave folly, though done in misguided loyalty. Yet the hand that extinguished your aunt's life is not yours. I must ask, however, who else knew you came here last night?" "No one," she whispered. "I crept from my lodgings by Bride Lane. My aunt forbade me to join her vigils. She said prayer was a burden she must bear alone. But I could not bear to see her sorrow unshared." Holmes released a thin breath, as though calculating weights and balances invisible to us. "You played at shadows," he said, "but another played at silence. That silence was permanent. Tell me, did your aunt speak of disputes in her charity, of Mr. Hargreave or Captain Doran?" Clara hesitated, glancing between us. "Yes," she admitted. "She quarrelled with them often. Mr. Hargreave wished to dismiss certain widows whose husbands had fallen into debt. My aunt refused. And Captain Doran, he's a rough man. She feared his temper, though she respected his courage. Yet neither, I think, wished her harm." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Fear and respect are uneasy companions. Did she ever mention a veil or a pin left behind?" Clara frowned. "She never spoke of such things. She wore no ornament save her wedding ring." "Why do you ask?" Holmes made no reply, but turned toward the door, his steps decisive. "Watson, escort Miss Vale home. I have business with the verger, Tom Grieve. Meet me in an hour at Baker Street." We obeyed. Clara walked beside me through the fog, silent save for the rustle of her cloak. She parted from me at her lodgings with a faint, troubled smile. When I reached Baker Street, Holmes was already there, pacing before the fire. His eyes gleamed with the restless brightness of discovery. "Watson," he said, "our curate's verger is a poor liar." He swore he heard the bolt fall at 10 o'clock, yet tonight I examined the socket more closely. There are 2 smears of grease, one fresh and one older. The older could not have been made this morning. Someone rehearsed the locking trick earlier, someone who had access to the chapel at will. That someone is Grieve. "You think he killed Mrs. Vale?" I asked. Holmes shook his head. "Not yet. The man is a pawn, not a player. He is strong enough to manage the bolt, but too timid to contrive the rest. He acted under instruction. The bell rope tells me that much. The bell rope? Indeed. A single toll at 2 in the morning is no accident. The weight of the rope is such that even a child could not pull it unawares. It was a signal, Watson, prearranged between accomplices. And mark this, the handkerchief folded upon the rail was not Mrs. Vale's. I traced its lacework pattern to a French maker whose goods are sold by only one London draper, in Cheapside. Tomorrow we shall call there. The next morning, under a cold drizzle, we did so. Holmes presented the description to the proprietor, who recognized it at once. "A gentleman purchased 2 such handkerchiefs last week," the man said. "A stout sailor with a booming voice. He bought them for a lady, so he claimed." "Captain Doran," I murmured. Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Precisely. One was left at the rail, the other may still be in his possession. We must confirm this at once." We found Doran at his lodgings, smoking a pipe whose fumes hung heavy in the room. At Holmes's sudden question he started visibly. "Yes, I bought handkerchiefs," he growled. "For a cousin abroad. What of it?" "Where is the second?" Holmes asked, his tone deceptively mild. Doran blustered, fumbled in a drawer, and produced a square of lace. "Here! Is it a crime to spend £1?" Holmes took it delicately, holding it to his nose. His expression hardened. "Do you know, Captain, that this bears the faintest odour of the same cosmetic that clung about Mrs. Vale's lips, and that your bottle upon the shelf contained a preparation of orange flower adulterated with arsenite?" "Stamford confirmed it. Do you deny it?" The captain's face darkened. "By thunder, I deny it. I bought what the apothecary sold. If poison there be, it is no work of mine." Holmes pocketed the handkerchief and regarded him coolly. "Then you will have no objection to accompanying us to St. Margaret's this evening. The truth will not long remain at sea." We left him fuming, and once outside, Holmes muttered, "The chain is tightening, Watson. Doran bought the means, but whether he wielded it or was himself deceived remains to be proved. Tonight we return to the chapel. I have asked Lestrade to be there. The play is nearly ready for its last act." That night, as the bells of St. Paul's tolled 9, we gathered once more in the dim nave of St. Margaret's, Holmes, myself, Lestrade with his bulldog air, Clara Vale pale but determined, and Captain Doran scowling like a trapped bear. Holmes placed the handkerchief upon the rail and set 2 tapers burning, their thin flames throwing long shadows across the stone. "Observe all of you," he said, his voice carrying in the gloom. "This is the scene of Mrs. Vale's last prayer. Here the poison was placed, here the bolt was contrived, here the bell tolled. One among us knows how each piece fits. And before the night is done, that person shall reveal themselves." The flames flickered, the shadows deepened, and I felt a shiver pass through me. For in Holmes's eyes burned the certainty of a hunter who has driven his quarry to the final clearing. The wavering tapers threw their glow upon the carved saint, upon the velvet cushion with its faint impress, and upon the anxious circle of faces. Holmes stood before the prie-dieu, one hand extended toward the rail, the other clasped behind his back. His voice, calm and resonant, filled the chapel as if it were a court of judgment. "Consider the arrangement," he said. "A lady of austere principle kneels here at her accustomed hour. The door is bolted from within, yet not by her hand. The verger hears the sound because he himself rehearsed the mechanism. He is the locksmith's catspaw, the willing servant of stronger minds. The handkerchief lies folded, scented with a cosmetic adulterated by poison. The scratch beneath the jaw tells us how it was administered, by the point of a veil pin dipped in that preparation. It was the work of a hand that bent close as though in the intimacy of assistance or affection. Clara Vale uttered a soft cry, but Holmes raised a finger for silence. 2 tapers were lit to heighten the illusion, their light falling in narrow pools that threw the rest into shadow. The bell was tolled to mark the hour of success, a signal to an accomplice waiting beyond. And when the deed was done, the bolt was slid home from without by the greased contrivance, giving us the semblance of a locked room. Thus was the lady left to her eternal silence. Lestrade grunted impatiently. "Fine talk, Mr. Holmes, but who held the veil pin?" Holmes's gaze moved across our company, lingering a moment upon Duran, then upon Clara, then upon the curate, who had rejoined us with a look of torment. "The one who profited most by her removal," he said. "Mr. Hargreave desired a freer hand with the charity. Captain Doran had quarrels and debts. Miss Vale sought to protect her aunt's memory, and unwittingly provided a cloak for darker schemes. But let us not guess when proof lies at hand. Captain Doran, you purchased the handkerchiefs. The question is, did you also purchase
Death? The sailor's beard bristled as he roared back. I did not. I bought trinkets, aye, but no death. By heaven, Holmes, I loved the woman in my rough way. She held me to account when no man dared. Would I slay her for that?" Holmes's eyes glittered. "Your words have the ring of truth, though your temper clouds them. No, I believe you were a dupe, supplied with poison under guise of a cosmetic. But there was another who knew precisely how it would serve. Reverend Pritchard, will you explain why the bell was tolled not once, but twice? Once at the signal of success, and once tonight at the moment when Miss Vale sought to repeat the vigil. You alone had constant access to the tower rope." The curate paled, his lips moving without sound. Clara gave a gasp, and Lestrade stepped forward like a terrier scenting blood. "By thunder, Holmes, do you mean—" "I mean," Holmes cut in, "that our reverend friend was not content with the place of humble curate. Mrs. Vale opposed his plans to divert funds toward a new mission of his devising. Her death removed an obstacle, and her niece's innocent masquerade afforded him the chance to perpetuate the illusion of the supernatural. He rehearsed the bolt, he instructed the verger, he tolled the bell, and he, Watson, was the one who bent close enough to offer a supporting hand, as the widow knelt, close enough to slip a poisoned pin to her flesh." At this, Pritchard staggered back, the colour draining from his cheeks. "No, you cannot prove it." Holmes's hand shot to his pocket and drew forth the second lace handkerchief taken from Doran's drawer. "On the contrary, this bears the trace of arsenite, transferred from the cosmetic he supplied to the captain under pretext of charity. Doran thought it a gift for Mrs. Vale. In truth, it was the instrument of her destruction. And here," he drew out a narrow brass rod, "is the verger's device for sliding the bolt from without. He admitted as much to me this afternoon, when pressed with a question or two." Lestrade clapped irons upon the curate before he could protest further. Pritchard's cries echoed pitifully in the chapel as he was led away. Clara, pale as the statue above us, leaned upon the rail. Doran bowed his great head, the tears standing in his eyes. Holmes extinguished the candles with a swift breath. The chapel sank into shadow. "So ends the widow's silent prayer," he said quietly. "A prayer answered not by heaven, but by the designs of men." Outside, the fog had thinned to a fine drizzle. Clara walked with us a little way, thanking Holmes with trembling sincerity. He received her gratitude with his customary aloofness, merely touching the brim of his hat before we saw her to her door. Doran lingered, muttered his own rough thanks, and departed into the night. Back at Baker Street, Holmes threw himself into his chair, lighting his pipe with a match struck against the mantel. The blue smoke curled
upward as he spoke, half to me and half to himself. The mechanics of murder, Watson, are rarely as important as the motives. Greed cloaked itself here in the garments of piety. It is an old disguise, but never a perfect one. The smallest inconsistencies betray it, a scent upon the air, a scratch upon the skin, a bolt greased in anticipation. The world, my dear fellow, is made up of trifles, and so are its crimes. I could not but marvel at the chain of reasoning that had led him step by step from a widow's silent vigil to the unmasking of a curate's ambition. And as the firelight flickered upon his sharp features, I was once more struck by the strange paradox of the man, aloof, sardonic, yet more deeply attuned to the hidden springs of human nature than any clergyman could ever hope to be. Holmes did not allow the matter to rest with the arrest of Reverend Pritchard, for in his mind a case was never complete until each thread had been tested and the pattern confirmed beyond the possibility of doubt. He sat long into the night at Baker Street, the smoke from his pipe drifting in blue wreaths toward the ceiling, while I recorded the particulars of the evening's confrontation. At length he stirred, knocked out the ashes against the grate, and fixed me with a look that carried the quiet intensity of a man still chasing the echo of a solution. "Watson," he said, "our curate's guilt is plain enough for Lestrade's purposes, but I remain uneasy. One detail resists alignment, the salt upon the chapel floor. That trace was too deliberate, too clean to be the accident of a seaman's boots. It was placed to mislead us, and I will not sleep soundly until I know by whose hand." I protested that the curate's own guilt was surely sufficient explanation. After all, he might have scattered the grains to suggest some maritime connection and deflect suspicion upon Doran. Holmes only shook his head. Pritchard was no subtle schemer. He had cunning, yes, but of the blunt and anxious sort. His tricks with the bolt and the bell rope were laborious, clumsy contrivances. This, Watson, was a different order of misdirection. It smacks of a mind capable of conceiving not merely concealment, but artistry. We must look again at the company of Mrs. Vale. The following morning he dispatched me with a note to Clara Vale, requesting her presence at Baker Street. She arrived just before noon, pale from sleeplessness, but composed. Holmes received her courteously, then, without preamble, asked, "Did your aunt ever speak of voyages beyond the Baltic? Did she ever allude to personal ties abroad?" Clara hesitated, her fingers twisting a handkerchief. "She once told me," she said, "that before her marriage she had spent a season in Marseille, attending upon a cousin. She never spoke warmly of it, but I gathered there had been some acquaintance there she wished to forget." Holmes's eyes lit with that cold gleam of satisfaction. Marseille? And her late husband was a ship-owner. Salt from southern ports could easily be procured by one still trading there. "Miss Vale, may I trouble you to think carefully? Did your aunt receive letters these past months that she concealed from the household?" "She did," Clara admitted after a pause. "I once surprised her burning a letter in the grate. She told me it was an old bill, but her face was troubled." Holmes rose and paced. "Then we have yet another hand in the matter, though unseen. Pritchard struck the blow, but he was not the composer of the symphony. He was an instrument played by another, one who remained content to let him shoulder the blame." At that moment Lestrade appeared, his expression smug. "We've got him tight, Mr. Holmes. The curate's confessed enough to hang himself twice over, spoke of conscience and necessity, and admitted to the pin. That's all we need." Holmes regarded him with mild disdain. "Confessions are the currency of the police, Inspector. I prefer proof. Did you, by chance, search the curate's lodgings?" We did, nothing but sermons and cassocks. Then you searched poorly. If Pritchard was moved to kill, he was moved by something more tangible than mere ambition. You will find, I wager, letters among his effects, letters that hinted at scandal written in a hand not his own. Bring them to me, and you may yet claim your laurel. Lestrade grumbled, but promised compliance. When he had gone, Holmes turned back to Clara. Your aunt's death, Miss Vale, is more than a parish tragedy. It is the final act of a drama begun years ago in Marseille. I must trace its prologue if we are to read the end. You may assist me by searching among your aunt's personal effects for any relics of that time. Trifles, even a trinket, may suffice. Bring them here. She promised to do so and departed. Holmes then fell into one of his deep reveries, sprawled across the settee with his long fingers interlaced, his eyes closed as though in slumber. I knew better than to disturb him. Hours passed thus until Clara returned with a small box of ivory, which Holmes received with keen interest. Within lay a miniature portrait of a dark, hawk-faced man in naval uniform, and beneath it a packet of papers soiled with smoke. Holmes spread the documents across the table. They were fragments of letters in French, which he translated swiftly. The gist was clear enough. A certain Lieutenant Armand Roche had known Honoria Vale in Marseille before her marriage, and had sought her aid thereafter in ventures of dubious honesty. The tone grew importunate, even menacing, until her replies ceased altogether. The last fragment contained a single phrase underlined, "The sea remembers." Holmes tapped the words. There, Watson, is the key. The salt upon the floor was Roche's signature, a taunt from afar. He employed Pritchard as his instrument, whispering of funds diverted, threatening exposure of ancient indiscretions. The curate, weak and vain, seized upon the scheme, but the artistry of the misdirection, the poisoned cosmetic, the maritime clue, that was Roche's hand. I asked in some astonishment how Holmes could be so certain. He smiled thinly. Because, my dear Watson, Roche is in London even now. Doran mentioned him unwittingly when he spoke of old companions who carried errors like medals. I recall the name from Admiralty records. A man disgraced for smuggling later vanished to the continent. He has returned to claim a debt of vengeance, and he used the curate as his dagger. That evening, Holmes sent word to Lestrade to watch the docks for a tall, dark-featured Frenchman who might be preparing passage. As for himself, he donned one of his many disguises, a burly waterman, complete with tar-stained hands and a shambling gait, and vanished into the night with the quiet assurance of a hunter nearing his quarry. I remained behind at Baker Street, pacing in restless anxiety. It was near midnight when the door burst open and Holmes strode in, his disguise discarded, his face alight with triumph. "Roche is taken," he declared. He attempted to board a packet for Calais under false papers. In his possession were letters to Pritchard, guiding every step of the crime, and a vial of the same poisoned preparation. The curate's hand struck the blow, but Roche composed the dirge. Lestrade now has all he needs, though I fear he will never know how close he came to crowning the wrong man entirely. He threw himself into his chair, lighting a fresh pipe. The sea remembers, Watson, but so do I. Another prayer answered, not by heaven but by reason. I could only marvel once more at the precision of his mind and the relentless justice it brought to bear upon the shadowed corners of London's fog. Holmes's triumph that night did not ease the matter in his mind. I found him, the following morning, still in his dressing gown, poring over the packet of Roche's letters with a frown that seemed more troubled than satisfied. His pipe had burned low, and the room was thick with the stale scent of shag. He greeted me with a curt nod and thrust one of the sheets across the table. "Read, Watson," he said. "Mark especially the dates." The letter was brief, written in a harsh hand that slanted as if driven by impatience. Roche implored Pritchard to act swiftly, to use the preparation supplied, and to ensure that the death occurred before the close of the month. The date was 3 days prior to Mrs. Vale's passing. I laid it down, puzzled. "The sequence is plain enough," I remarked. "Roche orders, Pritchard obeys, the widow dies." Holmes shook his head. "Plain, yes, but too plain. Consider, the cosmetic vial was found upon Roche's person when arrested. Why should he carry a duplicate if Pritchard already possessed enough to accomplish the deed? No, Watson, there was a double game here. Roche gave his curate the means, but he never trusted him. He carried his own supply, prepared for contingencies. That suggests he intended either to ensure the act himself or to repeat it should Pritchard falter." I felt a shiver. Then Mrs. Vale was doomed whichever hand moved against her. Precisely. But it raises another point. If Roche was in London, as his letters and his arrest prove, why did he not strike the blow directly? Why trust a nervous cleric with a task he could have executed silently? Unless... Holmes's voice dropped to that quiet intensity that heralded one of his flashes of deduction. Unless his true purpose was not the widow's death alone, but the ruin of the curate as well. "You mean he sought to destroy both?" Holmes's eyes gleamed. Roche was a man of vengeance, not justice. Honoria Vale had rejected him long ago. Pritchard, foolish and ambitious, was merely the nearest vessel for Roche's malice. He played one against the other, ensuring that guilt would fall where it could never rebound upon himself. That, Watson, is artistry of a particularly venomous kind. Before I could reply, Mrs. Hudson announced Inspector Lestrade. He bustled in, looking both satisfied and uneasy. "We've charged Roche," he said, "but there's a snag. He refuses to confess, claims he knew nothing of the widow's death, that the vial was for personal use, that Pritchard was the sole villain. Without more, the magistrate may see fit to leave us with but the curate in irons. Have you anything further, Mr. Hawkins?" Holmes smiled thinly. "Only the truth, Inspector. Roche's very silence betrays him. He is too practised a scoundrel to confess, but the evidence of his hand is woven into the pattern. Still, if you desire proof that will satisfy the dullest bench, you shall have it. Tonight we revisit St. Margaret's. There is one demonstration yet to be made." That evening found us once more beneath the chapel's dim arches. Clara Vale was present, at Holmes's insistence, her expression strained but resolute. Doran stood with folded arms, grim and silent, while Lestrade fidgeted beside the prie-dieu. Holmes had laid out the lace handkerchief, the vial, and the letters upon the velvet cushion, as though reconstructing the crime. "Observe carefully," he said. "Roche wished us to believe Mrs. Vale died by the curate's hand alone. But the truth lies in the very mechanism of the bolt." He beckoned to the verger, who reluctantly produced the brass rod Holmes had taken before. Holmes inserted it into the socket and slid the bolt with ease. "This device requires practice," he continued. "It is awkward, unwieldy, and betrays the trembling hand of an amateur. Pritchard could manage it only with Roche's guidance, yet when I examined the bolt that morning, I found not one smear of grease, but two, one older, one fresh. The older was laid by Roche himself days earlier, when he tested the method and showed Pritchard how it was done. That is why salt grains lay upon the floor. Roche used them as markers to measure his reach. The curate rehearsed, but the hand that taught him was Roche's." Lestrade's eyes widened, and Clara drew in her breath sharply. Holmes pressed on, his gaze fixed upon her. And there is one further proof. Miss Vale, when you repeated your aunt's vigil, you placed a handkerchief upon the rail, yet you did not scent it. Why? Because you had no knowledge of the poisoned preparation. Only one who carried both lace and vial could combine them into death. Roche carried both when apprehended. The inference is irresistible. For a long moment the chapel was silent, save for the drip of rain against the windows. Then Clara spoke, her voice trembling. "And my aunt? Did she know that Roche was here?" Holmes's expression softened a fraction. She knew enough to fear him, but she never guessed how near his hand was. Her silence, her secret burning of letters, was her last defence. It failed, for Pritchard's weakness opened the door. Yet rest assured, Miss Vale, the truth is now beyond concealment. Roche will face the law, and your aunt's name shall not be stained by the whisper of superstition. Lestrade straightened, his bulldog jaw set. "That'll do, Mr. Holmes. You've given me exactly what I need. I'll see the Frenchman held fast this time." He gathered up the exhibits with rough satisfaction and marched away. Doran placed a massive hand upon Clara's shoulder, awkward in his gentleness. "She was a stern lady," he said, "but she deserved better than treachery. I'll see the fun kept straight, Miss Vale, if it costs me my last farthing." Holmes extinguished the candles and led us out into the wet night. As we walked, I could not suppress my admiration. "You have unravelled a tangle that might have deceived a dozen courts," I said. Holmes shrugged. "It was but a question of proportion, Watson. A crime is a work of art. One must distinguish the brush of a master from the scrawl of an amateur. Pritchard provided the scrawl, but Roche painted the picture. It only remained for us to frame it correctly." He drew his cloak tighter against the drizzle. "Yet mark my words, Watson. The law may punish the hand, but it rarely reaches the mind that conceived. Roche will pay, but the world remains no safer for it. That is the true melancholy of detection." And with that sombre reflection we turned toward Baker Street, the gas lamps glowing faintly through the fog, like the weary eyes of London herself, ever watchful, ever burdened with secrets. The fog had scarcely lifted from the river when the morning papers carried the tale in bold type. "French adventurer arrested in Widow's Chapel mystery." The reports were thin on detail, as though Lestrade had supplied just enough to feed the appetite of the public, while keeping the choicest morsels for the magistrate's bench. Holmes read the account over breakfast with a faint curl of his lip, folding the sheet with surgical precision and setting it aside as one might discard a tool no longer useful. "Observe, Watson," he remarked, "how a carefully woven fabric is reduced to mere calico in the hands of Fleet Street. The curate becomes the sole perpetrator, Roche a shadowy accomplice, and the widow a tragic victim of piety carried to excess. No mention of cosmetics, of salt grains, of veil pins, yet these trifles are the warp and weft of the truth." I agreed, though I reminded him that the public has little appetite for details too fine to grasp. He shrugged, poured himself more coffee, and lapsed into silence, but I could see his mind still moving, restless and unsatisfied, as if the case, though practically resolved, had not yet yielded up its final lesson. By mid-morning, Clara Vale called at Baker Street. She carried herself with quiet dignity, though her eyes were shadowed from sleepless nights. Holmes received her with a courtesy that belied his usual aloofness. "I come only to thank you, Mr. Holmes," she said softly. "My aunt's name is already spoken of with less suspicion. You have preserved her honour." Holmes inclined his head, but did not smile. "I have preserved the truth, Miss Vale. Your aunt required no defence beyond that." She hesitated, then added, "And Captain Doran has promised to continue her work with the fund. It was her greatest wish." yet there remains a bitterness in my heart. To think that a man who once professed friendship to her could scheme so foully, it chills me. Hatred ages more slowly than affection, Holmes replied. Roche's rancour fermented over decades. Pritchard's weakness supplied the opportunity. Together they contrived what neither alone could achieve. Such alliances of spite and folly are common enough in the annals of crime. Clara looked at him with sudden intensity. And you, Mr. Holmes, does it not weary you to walk so constantly among shadows? For the first time, I saw Holmes pause, as though the question had touched some inner chord. He regarded her gravely. I am weary only when the shadows are left unexplored. So long as reason can pierce them, they serve me well. She seemed to accept this, and with a graceful bow, took her leave. When the door closed behind her, Holmes turned to me with an expression half ironic, half philosophical. An admirable young woman, Watson, yet better suited to a life of purpose than of repose. I trust she will find it. That evening, Lestrade arrived, full of bluster and importance. Roche, he declared, would be tried within the fortnight, with Pritchard certain to follow. The Frenchman had denied every charge, but could not explain away the letters nor the vial in his possession. The case, in Lestrade's words, was as tight as a ship's hatch. Holmes offered no contradiction, though I noted the faint quiver of amusement at his
lips. When Lestrade had gone, I asked him why he remained so pensive if the outcome was secure. Because, Watson, justice in the courts is a blunt instrument. Roche may be condemned, but the finer shades of his guilt will never be painted upon the record. The curate will hang as the instrument of the crime, while Roche may escape with transportation or even acquittal should a clever advocate sow confusion. The true balance of responsibility may never be struck. His tone carried neither indignation nor triumph, but something colder, an acceptance of the imperfection of human systems. It left me uneasy, though I could not refute his reasoning. 2 nights later, we returned briefly to St. Margaret's, summoned by Doran to inspect certain accounts of the fund. The chapel stood silent, its broken door repaired, its velvet cushion replaced. I confess a shudder passed through me at the sight, as though the very stones retained memory of the night's dark prayer. Doran met us with a sailor's blunt gratitude, laying before Holmes ledgers which showed the charity's health beyond reproach. She was stern, but she kept us honest, he said gruffly. I'll not see her work spoiled by rogues again. Holmes examined the entries with a quick eye, then closed the books. Your resolution does you credit, Captain. See that you keep it, for temptation comes not only in the guise of villains, but in the slow erosion of habit. Outside, the fog had thickened once more, muffling the city's ceaseless stir. As we walked back toward our lodgings, Holmes spoke with that curious detachment which so often masked his deepest convictions. This affair, Watson, has been remarkable less for its mechanics than for its psychology. A widow who sought silence found it too completely. A curate who craved importance found it in ruin. A sailor whose loyalty was questioned proved steadfast, and a foreign adventurer carried his rancour across years and seas, only to end in chains. In the interplay of these figures lies the true drama, not in the bolt, the pin, or the tapers. I ventured that his deduction had nevertheless turned upon those very trifles. Trifles, yes, he agreed, but trifles are only the signposts. The road itself is human folly. When we reached Baker Street, he cast off his cloak and seated himself by the fire with his violin across his knees. The first notes he drew were low, haunting, almost like the tolling of a distant bell. I watched him in silence, reflecting on how many such vigils we had shared, how often we had stood together at the crossroads of crime and conscience. At last he set down the bow and spoke with quiet finality. The widow's silent prayer, Watson, will not echo long in the world. Yet for us it remains a reminder that evil seldom walks alone. It drapes itself in innocence, borrows the hands of the weak, and cloaks itself in shadows. Our task is not to banish the shadows, but to strip them of their disguise. And with that, he leaned back, his eyes half closed, the smoke from his pipe mingling with the last mournful strains of the violin, while London outside continued its restless murmur, heedless of the justice achieved within its fog-draped heart. The weeks that followed brought no immediate lull to Baker Street, for the trial of Roche was the talk of every club and coffee house, and Lestrade called more than once to boast of his role in bringing the Frenchman to heel. Yet Holmes remained curiously detached, as if the spectacle of justice grinding forward had lost its savour. He read the accounts in the press with little comment, his violin serving more often as his confidant than I. At last, one damp morning, as I folded the Times, he spoke with a sudden sharpness. "You perceive, Watson, that Roche still denies his guilt. The papers paint him as a stoic, even a patriot wronged by circumstance. He claims the vial was his own medicinal tincture, the letters fabrications, and that the curate alone contrived the death. It is a clever posture, for juries are ever sympathetic to a man who holds his tongue and lets another hang in his stead. But surely the evidence, I began. Evidence, my dear fellow, is only as persuasive as the minds that weigh it. A jury may see in Pritchard's confession the whole of the crime, and in Roche's silence nothing but dignity. It would not be the first time that guilt escaped upon the tide of sentiment. I confess, Watson, I am not content. There is a piece missing still, a fragment that would bind the case beyond all escape. I asked him what more he required, since the letters, the vial, and the rehearsed bolt seemed proof enough. He struck a match, lit his pipe, and replied through the smoke. "Proof, yes, but of what? Of Roche's malice, certainly. Of his influence over Pritchard, undoubtedly. But the fatal act itself, the poisoned pin, remains attributed solely to the curate. If Roche guided that hand, we must show it. If he wielded his own, we must demonstrate it. Otherwise, a clever barrister may persuade 12 honest men that the Frenchman's role was but advisory, and advisory guilt seldom hangs." That very afternoon, Clara Vale called upon us again. Her face bore the strain of public scrutiny, yet her manner was resolute. She placed upon Holmes's desk a small case of polished wood which she had found among her aunt's effects. Inside lay a pair of spectacles with thin gold rims, one lens cracked across the centre. "My aunt never wore them," Clara explained, "but I found them lodged behind the cushion of her chair in the vestry. At first I thought them of no importance, but then I wondered, might they belong to the man Roche?" Holmes's eyes gleamed as he lifted the case. "Excellent, Miss Vale. You have furnished precisely what we lacked. These spectacles are not English make. The design is French, from a Marseilles optician whose work I have seen before. The cracked lens tells us more. It matches the fracture of a pane in the chapel's south lancet, where someone pressed close in the dark. Roche was there, Watson, in the very act. He observed, he directed, perhaps even leaned near enough to steady the trembling hand that bore the pin. This is no advisory guilt, it is presence at the scene." Clara looked at him with gratitude, though her voice trembled. "Then my aunt's death will not be laid at the door of the weak alone. That comforts me." Holmes bowed his head gravely. When she had gone, he turned to me with suppressed excitement. "Here, Watson, is the final stitch. The spectacles place Roche in the chapel. Even if he did not pierce the skin himself, he bent close enough to ensure the act.
I shall place them before Lestrade, and Roche's stoicism will crumble when he sees the noose tighten about his neck. That night we attended the trial at the Old Bailey, the court thick with spectators and the press, scribbling furiously. Pritchard, pale and broken, repeated his confession, speaking of temptation and whispered promises. Roche sat rigid, his hawk-like features betraying no emotion. When Lestrade produced the vial and the letters, the defence countered with claims of forgery and coincidence. It seemed for a moment that the Frenchman's silence might indeed sway the jury. Then Holmes, called unexpectedly to the stand, produced the spectacles. In his calm, clinical manner, he described their make, their origin, and the cracked lens that matched the vestry window. He spoke of the salt grains, of the grease, of the veil pin, weaving each trifle into a tapestry no jury could mistake. These, he concluded, holding the spectacles aloft, were found among the widow's belongings, yet she never wore them. They are Roche's. They place him not merely in London, but in the chapel itself, at the very moment of death. No innocent adviser leaves his eyes behind at a crime scene. A murmur swept the court. For the first time, Roche's composure faltered. His hand twitched, his jaw clenched, and a flicker of fear passed across his face. It was enough. The jury, struck by the weight of the deduction, delivered their verdict without hesitation. Guilty. As we left the court, Lestrade grasped Holmes's hand with uncharacteristic warmth. "You've done it again, Mr. Holmes. London owes you a debt." Holmes inclined his head, but once we were alone he spoke more softly. "It was not London, Watson, but truth that required defence. The curate's weakness would have borne the whole blame, while Roche, whose malice orchestrated all, might have walked free. That balance, at least, is restored." We walked back through the crowded streets, the lamps casting long gleams upon the wet pavement. Holmes was silent, his thoughts clearly inward. At last he said, "Justice, Watson, is never complete. Pritchard will hang for his folly, Roche for his vengeance, yet the widow herself remains beyond. Recall, the world will move on, forgetting her silent prayer. But we who heard it must remember that in the smallest of details lies the key to truth, and that, my dear fellow, is the only solace our craft affords." I said nothing, for I knew no answer could add to his reflection. The city hummed around us, heedless of the fate of a widow, a curate, or a vengeful Frenchman. But I felt once more the weight and wonder of standing beside Sherlock Holmes, whose mind, like the flame of a taper in the gloom, illuminated even the darkest corners of human deceit. The verdict against Roche brought a certain clamour of relief to the city, yet in Baker Street I sensed no triumph in Holmes. He accepted the congratulations of Lestrade with a cool nod, listened without interruption to the glowing accounts in the Times, and then laid the paper aside as though it were no more than the wrapping for a parcel of fish. For 2 days he paced restlessly, his pipe clamped between his teeth, while I, believing the case concluded, tried in vain to draw him into ordinary talk. At last, one evening, as the rain lashed against the windows, he broke his silence. "There is a postscript, Watson," he said, striking a match and bending over the fire. "Every tale has its coda, and ours is not yet written. Roche is condemned, Pritchard awaits his own fate, but I have had from Clara Vale a letter that troubles me. It seems her aunt, in her final months, had made inquiries of her own into the fund. She feared corruption not merely from Hargreave and Doran's disagreements, but from subtler leaks. I must be sure, Watson, that justice for her extends beyond the gallows. I protested that the accounts Doran had shown us were sound. Holmes waved my words aside. Sound on the surface, yes, but one must dive below the waterline to see if the hull is whole. Tomorrow we shall pay another visit to Vale and Company. Thus it was that we found ourselves once more in the sombre offices by the river. Mr. Hargreave received us with chilly civility, his square jaw tighter than ever. Holmes asked to see the ledgers again, and, though Hargreave complied, I observed a flicker of impatience in his eye. For an hour Holmes bent over the figures, his pencil flying, while I grew increasingly bewildered by columns of numbers and shipments. At length he pushed back the book with a satisfied snap. "The widow's instincts were sound," he said. "There are irregularities here that no honest steward would tolerate. Certain consignments of timber and grain are marked at inflated values, their losses written off as unavoidable. In truth, the profits have been skimmed, the fund depleted by artifice. Mr. Hargreave, you have kept your figures as you claimed, but you have kept them for yourself." Hargreave's composure cracked. A flush rose in his cheeks. "This is an outrage! You accuse me without proof." Holmes's voice grew cold as steel. "On the contrary, I accuse you with proof. In every column of your own hand, the overvaluation of Baltic shipments coincides precisely with the voyages of ships in which you hold private interest. Mrs. Vale resisted your proposals because she discerned their dishonesty. Roche exploited that tension, but you, sir, had already enriched yourself by her silence. Had she lived longer, she would have exposed you. Her death, though not of your contriving, has served your purse most conveniently." For a moment I thought Hargreave might strike him, so fierce was the man's glare. But at last he mastered himself and said only, "You have no authority here, Holmes. This is a matter for trustees." "Precisely," Holmes returned, "and I have already written to them. Your name will not be dragged before the courts, but you will retire from the fund and make restitution. If you do not, the ledgers shall speak louder than any witness." We left him seething, and on the pavement outside, Holmes allowed himself the faintest smile. "Thus the widow's prayer is answered in full, Watson. Not only is her death avenged, but her work preserved from corruption. Captain Doran will see to that. He is a rough fellow, but an honest one." That evening, Clara Vale came to Baker Street once more. Holmes told her, with a gentleness rare in him, that the fund was safe and the accounts cleansed. Tears stood in her eyes as she thanked him. "You have given my aunt more than justice," she said. "You have given her peace." Holmes bowed gravely, and when she was gone he sank into his chair with a look of weary satisfaction. "It is finished now, Watson. The shadows are dispelled." I could not resist a smile. "And perhaps you will allow yourself a night's rest without pursuing phantoms." He drew at his pipe and regarded me with that sardonic glint. "Rest, my dear fellow, is for those whose minds are unoccupied, but you are correct. The case is closed. What remains is but philosophy." The fire burned low, the rain slackened, and I took up my pen to record the affair. As I wrote, I reflected on how each step of the investigation had built upon the last, each trifle leading us deeper into the labyrinth, until Holmes, with his unfailing logic, had drawn the threads into a single rope, strong enough to hang a villain and preserve a widow's honour. When I laid down my pen at last, Holmes was playing his violin, the notes solemn yet strangely tender, as though he were weaving the memory of the widow's silent prayer into music that might outlast the fog of London itself. And I thought not for the first time that though the world may forget the details of such a case, I should not, for I had stood beside Sherlock Holmes and seen how reason, applied with brilliance and compassion, could transform even the darkest tragedy into something approaching justice. The trial concluded with Roche condemned, Pritchard sentenced, and the newspapers sated with another sensational column for the breakfast, Tables of London. Yet for those of us who had walked each shadowed step of the inquiry, The outcome was not mere spectacle, but a sober reminder of the frailties of human nature. Clara Vale, though still haunted by her aunt's fate, bore herself with quiet strength. Captain Doran, chastened by his entanglement, devoted himself with unexpected diligence to the stewardship of the fund, as though the weight of Honoria Vale's memory pressed him into integrity. Even Lestrade, whose vanity was well fed by the acclaim, admitted to me in an unguarded moment that without Holmes the truth might never have been disentangled from the tangle of lies and half-confessions. For my part, I marvelled once again at the precision of Holmes's method. From the scent of orange flower upon the air to the faint smear of grease in a bolt socket, to the cracked lens of a forgotten spectacle, he had drawn forth the entire fabric of crime. Each thread by itself was fragile. Together, woven by his hand, they formed a rope strong enough to bind both the weak curate and the vengeful Frenchman. And yet what struck me most was not the brilliance of the deduction, but Holmes's relentless insistence that justice extend beyond the gallows. It was not enough for him that the guilty be punished. He would see also that the widow's work was preserved, her name unsullied, her silent prayer answered in full. One evening, some weeks after the verdict, I found him by the fire, his violin set aside, his gaze lost in the smoke. "You see, Watson," he said quietly, "evil rarely arrives unaccompanied. It borrows the hands of the weak, the silence of the fearful, the greed of the ambitious. Roach and Pritchard were but the instruments of older sins, resentments unforgotten, opportunities unchecked. We did not banish the shadows, we merely showed their true shapes. That is the best our craft can ever claim." He would say no more, and I did not press him. For in that moment I understood what he never spoke aloud, that beneath his sardonic wit and icy logic there lay a conscience which, though rarely revealed, guided every deduction he made. Holmes might laugh at the world's folly, deride its institutions, and scorn its sentiment, yet in his heart he pursued truth, not for fame nor fortune, but because truth alone could restore the balance disturbed by crime. And so the case of the widow's silent prayer passed into the annals of those investigations which will never be known to the public in their fullness, but which remain vivid to me when I recall the darkened chapel, the toll of the hidden bell, the folded handkerchief upon the rail. I see not merely the apparatus of murder, but the patient figure of my friend bending above each clue, coaxing sense from silence until the prayer of the widow, unanswered in life, found its echo in justice. Thus ended one of the most singular cases in which I had the privilege to accompany Sherlock Holmes, leaving me, as ever, with admiration for his genius and with the quiet hope that in his relentless pursuit of truth he found some measure of peace amid the shadows he so unflinchingly explored.